There are men who seem untouchable. Men whose laughter fills every room, whose voice wraps around you like warm silk, whose smile makes the whole world believe that some people were simply born lucky. Dean Martin was that man. To the millions who adored him, he was the very definition of cool, unhurried, unshakable, impossibly charming. He held a glass of whiskey on every stage, cracked jokes that landed like velvet, and sang in a voice so smooth it felt like the world had been turned down a notch just for him. But here is the thing about men who seem untouchable. They feel everything. They just learn, very early, to make sure nobody sees it. Behind the tuxedo and the easy grin, Dean Martin carried wounds that never healed. Behind the sold-out shows at the Sands Hotel and the laughter of 40 million television viewers, there was a man who ate dinner alone night after night. A man who lost the thing he loved most in the world and never recovered. A man who, in his final years, sat quietly in a Beverly Hills restaurant while his ex-wife, the woman he had loved and lost decades before, watched over him from a nearby table, unable to save him, unable to leave him. This is the story of how Dean Martin's life fell apart. And it is the story of Jean Martin, the woman who stood beside him through glory, survived the heartbreak of their divorce, and then spent her remaining years watching the man she never stopped loving slowly disappear. It is not a glamorous story. It is not the story Hollywood wanted to tell. But it is the true one, full of grief, loyalty, love, and the particular kind of devastation that fame can never protect you from. Dean Martin was not born into elegance. He was born Dino Paul Crosetti on June 7, 1917, in Steubenville, Ohio, a gritty industrial town pressed against the banks of the Ohio River. His parents, Gaetano and Angela Crosetti, were Italian immigrants who had crossed an ocean chasing a better life. His father ran a small barbershop. His mother sang Italian folk songs around a house that smelled of garlic and olive oil and the particular warmth of a family that didn't have much money but didn't much care. Dino grew up caught between two worlds. At home, everything was Italian. The food, the language, the music, the laughter. But the moment he stepped outside, he was an outsider. When he started school, he barely spoke English. His accent drew mockery. Other children mimicked him. Teachers grew impatient. He was a bright boy trapped inside a language barrier, and the humiliation of those early years shaped him in ways that lasted a lifetime. He learned to use humor as a shield. He learned to keep his real feelings hidden behind a smile. Those were survival skills that later became the foundation of his entire stage persona. By the time he reached 10th grade, he had dropped out entirely. The classroom had given him nothing but embarrassment, and the streets of Steubenville offered something far more interesting, the feeling of being alive. He worked wherever he could. He labored in steel mills, pumped gas, delivered milk, and ran bootleg liquor during the final years of Prohibition. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet, a scrappy welterweight who absorbed more punishment than he dealt out. He later joked that he won all but 11 of his 12 fights, which was true in the way that the best jokes always are. It contained something that hurt. The boxing left him with a crooked nose, scarred hands, and a body that knew what it felt like to be knocked down and get back up anyway. That would prove useful later in life, when the blows came from directions no fighter could anticipate. It was music that saved him. While working as a croupier in an illegal casino tucked behind a Steubenville tobacco shop, he would sing softly between games, not performing exactly, just filling the air. One evening, a bandleader named Ernie McKay heard him and offered him a job. Dean said yes without hesitating. Something in him had been waiting for exactly that moment. He performed under several names before settling on Dean Martin, a suggestion from bandleader Sammy Watkins, who told the young singer that his talent was real but his name needed to sound less foreign, more American. Dean Martin. 2 simple words. But they carried the entire weight of a reinvention. The immigrant's son from Steubenville became something new, smooth, polished, effortlessly American. And the extraordinary thing was, it fit him perfectly. Dean Martin's first marriage was not a Hollywood story. It was a working-class Ohio story, which in many ways makes it sadder. In 1941, he married Elizabeth Ann McDonald, known to everyone as Betty, a young woman from his hometown who fell in love with him before anyone outside of Steubenville had ever heard his name. Betty married a struggling singer with a crooked nose and a dream, not a star. She was there through the small clubs, the late nights, the unpaid gigs, and the suffocating uncertainty of a career that had not yet decided whether it was going anywhere at all. Together they built a family. Their children arrived in quick succession: Craig in 1941, Claudia in 1944, Gail in 1945, and Dina in 1948. 4 children in 7 years. Betty was raising them largely alone while Dean chased the spotlight across Ohio and Pennsylvania, then further afield as his reputation grew. She was loyal and devoted, but the marriage was quietly breaking apart from the inside. As Dean's career climbed, the distance between them widened into something uncrossable. His world was filling up with glamour and temptation, late nights and beautiful strangers. Betty, meanwhile, struggled severely with alcoholism, a private battle that consumed her even as she tried to hold the family together. Both of them were lost in their own ways, but their losses were pulling them in opposite directions. By 1949, the marriage was over. Dean filed for divorce and was granted custody of all 4 children, an unusual outcome for that era that reflected just how serious Betty's condition had become. She moved to San Francisco and spent the rest of her life away from the fame that had helped destroy her marriage. She died in 1989, largely forgotten by the public, a quiet casualty of a life that had once brushed against greatness and found it burning. Just 1 week after the divorce was finalized, 1 week, Dean Martin married again. Her name was Jean Bieger. She was a model from Miami, Florida, a former Orange Bowl queen who was strikingly beautiful and possessed of a calm, steady dignity that would prove essential in the turbulent decades ahead. Their wedding on September 1, 1949, was held with his friend and comedy partner Jerry Lewis serving as best man. It was a celebration full of laughter and optimism, and for a while, it seemed like Dean had genuinely found his footing. Jean was nothing like the frantic world Dean inhabited. She was grounded, warm, and organized in a way that Dean, for all his charm, never was. She brought order to a life that was perpetually on the verge of chaos. She raised not only her own 3 children with Dean, Dino Paul Jr., born in 1951, Ricky, born in 1953, and Gina, born in 1956, but also Dean's 4 children from his first marriage. 7 children under one roof. Jean managed all of it with grace and patience that most people simply do not possess. To the outside world, they looked like the perfect American family. Dean, the charismatic star. Jean, the elegant, devoted wife. Children everywhere, laughing and tumbling through a life that most people could only dream of. But fame does not sit still, and the life Jean had built was always being pulled at from the edges. When Dean Martin ended his decade-long comedy partnership with Jerry Lewis in 1956, the entertainment world assumed he was finished. He had been the straight man, the handsome foil to Lewis's manic brilliance, and many in Hollywood believed that without Lewis, Martin had nothing. Critics wrote him off with barely a second thought. They were spectacularly wrong. Within just a few years, Dean Martin had reinvented himself so completely that the Jerry Lewis years began to look like prologue. He found his people in Las Vegas, where Frank Sinatra had assembled a loose constellation of talent and personality that the press would eventually call the Rat Pack. Along with Sammy Davis Jr., Joey Bishop, and Peter Lawford, Dean and Frank turned the Las Vegas Strip into their private kingdom. Their residency at the Sands Hotel became the hottest ticket in the country. Night after night, they walked on stage looking like men who had just wandered in from a very good party, and somehow that was exactly what audiences wanted. Dean's stage persona during those years was a masterpiece of constructed illusion. The loosened tie, the whiskey glass that was almost always apple juice, the slurred words and half-finished sentences, all of it was performance. Those who worked closely with him knew that Dean Martin was one of the sharpest, most controlled performers in the business. He had spent years crafting the impression of effortlessly, and he had gotten so good at it that even people who knew him sometimes forgot they were watching an act. Frank Sinatra, by most accounts the center of gravity in the Rat Pack, once reportedly admitted that Dean was the only one among them who was ever truly sober. While Sinatra stayed up until dawn gambling and drinking, Dean would finish his show, slip away quietly, go home, watch television, and fall asleep. The image of the hard-living swinger was entirely fictional. The real Dean Martin was private, introverted, and remarkably disciplined about his actual personal habits. His film work during this period silenced every remaining critic. In Rio Bravo alongside John Wayne, he played a recovering alcoholic gunfighter with a complexity and emotional honesty that genuinely startled audiences. In The Young Lions, he held his own alongside Montgomery Clift and Marlon Brando, two actors considered among the finest of their generation. He proved, again and again, that there was real depth behind the easy smile. And then in 1965 came The Dean Martin Show on NBC, which became one of the defining programs of American television. Dean negotiated extraordinary terms, no rehearsals, one shooting day per week, and eventual ownership of the program. NBC, perhaps desperate enough to agree to anything, said yes. The result was an enormous cultural phenomenon. Over 264 episodes, with audiences routinely exceeding 40 million viewers per week, Dean Martin became a fixture of American home life. He walked onto that stage every week looking completely unprepared, and that was the entire genius of it. America didn't want Polish. America wanted Dean. But while the show played in living rooms across the country, Jean was watching something else entirely. She was watching her husband drift. The absences had become longer. The rumors had become harder to ignore. The infidelities, which had plagued the marriage almost from its beginning, had moved from whisper to something approaching open knowledge in Hollywood circles. Jean had forgiven him many times, more times, she would later suggest, than anyone could count. She was not a naive woman, and she was not a passive one. She had simply loved him with a particular fierceness that outlasted most of her own good judgment about the situation. By the early 1970s, even that was not enough. In 1973, after 24 years of marriage, 7 children, and a life built entirely around his needs and his career, Jean filed for divorce. Dean would marry once more after that. A brief union with a much younger woman named Catherine Horn that collapsed within 3 years, leaving him more alone than before. But everyone who knew him well understood that Jean had been the great love of his life, and that losing her had taken something from him that no subsequent success could replace.